They called Ciudad Juárez the Killing Fields, a place where women were harvested in plain sight. At the same time, the factories kept humming and the buses kept running. In November of 2001, 8 young women were found in a cotton field at a busy intersection, public, visible, impossible to deny. And within 2 days, officials said the case was solved. But the evidence keeps coming back wrong. A Soriana bag under an underpass, a clean van, DNA that won't match, names corrected years later, voices threatened into silence. If this is one of the most brutal yet unresolved crime sagas in Latin American history, who benefited from the quiet? I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The cotton field sits where the city pretends to be ordinary, a busy corner, cars and commerce, a strip of life that could pass for normal if you don't look too closely. And yet, at Ejército Nacional in Paseo de la Victoria, across from the Association of Maquiladoras, 8 young women were found in November of 2001, in ditches, under trash, inside a parcel people used as a shortcut. That is the first contradiction. The grave was public, the city drove past it. So the question has to arrive early, before the mind reaches for a single monster and a clean ending. How could so many women disappear and die in plain sight over years, while buses kept running, while assembly lines kept humming, while officials kept promising order? In Ciudad Juárez, the mystery is not only who, it is how a whole ecology survives. Serial predators, opportunistic violence, scapegoated suspects, forced confessions, corruption, intimidation, and the paperwork going quiet at the exact moment truth gets close. Juárez lives on the lip of a border, like a mouth that never stops swallowing movement. On one side, El Paso's lights look measured and calm, the geometry of routine. On the other side, Juárez expands into dust. Colonias built from cinder blocks and plywood, pallets turned into walls, curtains as doors, a fine white powder riding the wind and touching everything: skin, laundry, windowsills, the inside of a child's throat. In this landscape, survival becomes a commute, and commutes become routes strangers learn. If you stand near a bus stop in Juárez at shift change, you can feel the city's pulse without needing statistics. The doors open, the crowd compresses, lunch pails knock against knees. A girl adjusts her ponytail with one hand and holds her paycheck envelope with the other. She looks down the road the way people do when they're trying not to look afraid. She doesn't announce fear. She edits herself into something smaller, something quicker, something less noticeable. That editing becomes muscle memory in a city like this. The maquiladoras taught the city a schedule. The drug trade taught it fear. Together, they taught a dangerous lesson. Life can be cheap if the machine needs it to be. In the 1990s, during the North American Free Trade Agreement era, factories raked in fortunes for shareholders, while workers' wages barely covered survival. The peso devaluation of 1994 crushed the middle class. It pushed more families toward the border in search of work. More workers, more buses, more long routes. More vulnerability is built into daily life. And the cruelty is that this vulnerability was not hidden. It was visible. Everyone knew which routes young women took home. Everyone knew the dirt roads that turned into mud when it rained. Everyone knew which streetlights didn't work. Everyone knew that a young worker might have to cross an empty lot or cut beneath an overpass because the bus stop was too far from home. These were not secret pathways. They were the city's design. And in Juarez, design can become destiny. And then the murders became their own kind of schedule. Investigative reporter Diana Washington Valdez called Juarez the Killing Fields, a harvest of women, because the pattern repeated like production: disappearance, denial, discovery, then the next. Harvest hurts more in a city built on extraction. Juarez harvests labor, it harvests dollars. And in the darkest years, the evidence left behind suggests it also harvested girls, because impunity makes repetition possible, and repetition is what creates a field. But when a wound lasts long enough, rumors grow teeth. Juarez produced stories of satanic rituals, snuff films, organ trafficking, secret cults, powerful juniors, and foreign hit squads. Those stories are cultural reactions to abandonment. People reach for explanations equal to pain. We will acknowledge them as part of the city's emotional weather. Then we come back to what the record shows again and again: negligence, misogyny, corruption, torture, evidence mishandled, intimidation, and institutions that treated women's deaths as an annoyance rather than an emergency. One of the deepest insults in this saga is how often the city's leaders spoke as if the problem was perception, not bodies, as if the real danger was bad publicity, as if the mothers were an inconvenience. The paperwork doesn't only go quiet, it goes strategic. It uses language that sounds professional, orderly, and calm as families live through a storm. And that's how a system protects itself, not only by failing, but by narrating the failure as normal. Campo Algodonero, this cotton field case, is our spine because it concentrates everything into one frame. A public parcel beside commerce, 8 victims, a press conference declaring victory in 2 days, confessions and torture allegations. Evidence appears later in a grocery bag, DNA refusing to cooperate with the official story, misidentifications corrected years later, a mother dying without knowing if her daughter was dead or alive, a bone fragment crossing a bridge because families no longer trusted what the state said. This is not just a crime scene, it is a portrait of a system. To feel how the cotton field becomes a verdict, you have to go back to when Juárez first learned the pattern. August 10th, 1995. Olga Alicia Carrillo Perez, 20 years old, vanished in downtown Juárez. She worked at a shoe store and was saving money for college. She was active in the youth wing of the National Action Party, the PAN, freshly in power after decades of pre-control. She planned to attend a 7:30 meeting at party headquarters on Avenida 16 de Septiembre and Cinco de Mayo. Ordinary politics, ordinary hope. Then she did not come home. Her mother, Irma, became what Juárez forces mothers to become, an investigator without a badge. Flyers, questions, street corners, co-workers. A desperate geometry of searching. Inside the party itself, something turned cold. The notes record that the city's incoming mayor had arranged a youth retreat. After Olga was reported missing, he forbade young members from helping search for her. The first pressure isn't always from criminals. Sometimes it comes from structures protecting their own image. And when you say search in Juárez, you have to imagine what that really means. It means walking the same streets your daughter walked, trying to see the city through her eyes. It means asking strangers questions and watching their faces decide whether to answer. It means stepping into offices where your grief is treated like paperwork. It means learning which doors are always closed and which clerks look away. It means hearing the same phrase again and again, dressed in different tones. Wait, come back tomorrow. She probably ran off. Maybe she had a boyfriend. Maybe she's out partying. Maybe you don't know your own child. Olga's body was later found in Lot Bravo, a parcel at the south end of the city, where other teenage girls and young women were also found in 1995. Authorities charged an Egyptian national, Abdelatif Sharif, but the mother did not feel the truth had settled. She was told one thing, then another, confusion over where her daughter's remains belonged in the official story. A bag of bones, she said. And later, when she spoke with a journalist on the phone, the line filled with static. The call ended abruptly, and her outgoing calls stopped working for days. In this story, surveillance is not a metaphor. It is a sound on the line. Silvia Elena Rivera Morales was last seen alive on July 11, 1995, on her way to school. She was a teenager who liked to dance, loved music, and lived in ordinary joy. Her body was found on September 2nd, 1995, and the details destroyed her family. Her mother later said her husband lost the will to live after identifying her. That is how violence spreads. It does not only take a girl, it rearranges a household, it turns love into guilt, it turns sleep into a rumor. Adriana Torres Marquez, 15, was last seen in front of a Tres Hermanos shoe store across from the cathedral in downtown Juárez. Her body was found later off the highway toward Casas Grandes. Elizabeth Castro Garcia, 17, was last seen at Juárez Avenue and Vicente Guerrero in downtown and attended a computer school near the railroad tracks. Her body was later found near the Casas Grandes highway. The pattern is the horror. Weekdays, afternoons, normal errands, the city's densest, most patrolled sector. Nobody saw anything. In Juárez, that kind of collective not seeing is not a magic trick. It is fear or complicity. Downtown is where you go to feel safe because there are more people, more lights, more storefronts. Downtown is where you go because it's the center of the world if you're poor and don't own a car. Downtown is where the buses knot together. Downtown is where tourists cross, buy trinkets and liquor, and pretend they're visiting an exotic version of normal life. And it's exactly there, near the cathedral, near the shoe stores, near the tracks, that girls vanished. The city learned something terrifying. Visibility does not equal protection. Then the desert edges became a chapter the city could not deny. In March and April of 1996, multiple bodies were found in Lomas de Polio, a poor neighborhood coated in fine white dust that never really leaves your skin. The record describes victims through belongings, factory smocks, identification cards, jewelry, a watch with a Philips logo, because that is how the dead are returned to families, as objects before they are returned as truth. The dust matters because it becomes the story's texture, a place where poverty is not scenery, it is exposure. One of those victims, Rosario Garcia Leal, 17, is remembered in the file by what was found near her body: clothing, a factory smock, small personal items, and identification cards bearing her photograph. The file notes sperm was found and then goes quiet about what became of it. That silence is a theme. Evidence appears, then disappears into the system. And when evidence vanishes, the field grows. Because the killers learned something crucial: the state will not pin them down. Now, place these crimes inside the economic machine. Maquiladores recruited young women because they were seen as reliable, replaceable, and cheap. Some workers could be as young as 14 with parental permission. And the record notes that it was not unusual for factories to hire younger workers with fake documents. Wages were a few dollars a day in the early 2000s, barely enough to survive. Entire families worked and pooled income. That means a girl's commute was not just her commute. It was the household's lifeline. When she vanished, grief arrived with hunger. And Juárez had the second engine, the drug trade, with corruption that did not stop at the river. Men vanished too, hundreds taken away by armed commandos wearing police uniforms and badges. Witnesses saw it in daylight. And the system often treated those disappearances as normal, as cartel business, as somebody else's problem. In a city where police are feared and sometimes compromised, predators do not need brilliance. They need permission. Impunity is permission given without words. Now come with me to Lomas de Polio, but not as a tourist, as a daughter, as a mother. The wind is always moving, the dust coats your mouth. Homes are patched together from discarded pallets, old mattresses, and cardboard. Dogs roam the streets. Children turn desolation into a playground because that's what they do. This is where Sagrario González Flores lived, 17 years old, with an angelic face, singing in a church choir, wanting guitar lessons to help at Sunday Mass. Her family was close-knit. That normality is what makes the violence obscene. There was nothing reckless about this girl's life. On April 16, 1998, Sagrario left her General Electric Maquiladora shift in mid-afternoon and headed home. 2 buses. A downtown transfer, about 7 miles to downtown, then another long ride toward the east edge. She had been switched from the night shift to the day shift. That meant more daylight, yes, but it also meant no relatives escorting her home. The file insists on this detail because it shows how vulnerability can be manufactured by something as simple as scheduling. There was plenty of light left in the day. Still, she vanished. The family searched fast. Flyers, questions, sleepless nights. 12 days later, passersby stumbled on her body in the Val de Juárez area. The file records that she was stabbed and strangled. Her mother, Paula, told a story that sounds like an omen because grief reaches for meaning when institutions provide none. Sagrario had 2 parrots named Mary and Luis. Mary died the day Sagrario failed to come home. Luis flew away into the mountains the day before the body was found. In Juárez, even birds become part of memory because the official truth is so scarce. From Sagrario's case, activism grew. Voices without echoes formed and demanded justice. Families painted black crosses on pink squares across the city. Black for death, pink for youth and promise. Each new cross was a new count that the state could not be trusted to keep. The group struggled just to exist. Sometimes members could not attend meetings because they did not have money for bus fare. Poverty even starved activism, and yet they persisted because silence is what predators want most. By 1999, officials tried to deliver closure. A teenage girl survived an assault and identified a bus driver. Authorities used that to build a broader narrative about the bus driver's suspects. The governor announced, "This nightmare is over. It is finished." But the killings did not stop. And this becomes important for Campo Algodonero, because by the time 8 bodies were found in the cotton field, the city had already lived through 2 earlier clusters, Lope Bravo and Lomas de Polio, and had already been trained to distrust official endings. Now move to 2001, when the cotton field becomes unavoidable. November of that year was soaked in death. A woman who worked as a dancer was found dead in a motel room at the Motel Royal on Tecnologico Avenue, also known as the Pan American Highway. 4 young men were abducted, tortured, and murdered after leaving Hooligans nightclub on the same road. Sources allege police and a relative of drug lord Amado Carrillo Fuentes were implicated, but no one was arrested. And across the street from the Motel Royal, earlier that year, on February 21st, 2001, the body of 17-year-old Lilia Alejandra Garcia was found. Death seemed to permeate Juárez, and this is where the city's ritual begins to show itself. The ritual of delay. A girl goes missing. Her family goes to the police. The police ask them to wait. They hint that the girl ran away. They suggest she had a double life. They treat the family as if they are exaggerating. Hours become a day becomes a week, and in the meantime, the desert keeps its own schedule. When a system delays the first hours of a disappearance, it does not simply make a mistake. It increases the chance that a woman will never be found alive. That is how neglect becomes lethal. Then, on November 6th and 7th, 2001, a passerby spotted a body in an irrigation ditch that cut across the cotton field parcel at Ejército Nacional and Paseo de la Victoria. Investigators and forensic staff arrived. Cadets from the police academy were sent to assist with the search. The bodies were in various stages of decomposition. The youngest victim was probably 14. The location was obscene in its visibility, across from the Maquiladora Association, near roads named for industry architects, surrounded by housing in a commercial corridor that looked like any U.S. suburb with a Walmart, restaurants, and gyms. This was not a hidden ravine. This was a message written in daylight. The parcel itself becomes a character in the story because of what it says about daring. People dumped trash there. People crossed it because it saved time. That means bodies were placed where they would be found and where they would be found with maximum shame. The cotton field is not far from wealth. It is not far from respectable facades. It is not far from the city's modern face. And that is why the discovery struck like a slap. If bodies could be dumped there, then no one could claim ignorance. Not the businesses, not the police, not the politicians, not the city. And then came the press conference. November 10th, 2001, a Sunday, Chihuahua State Attorney General Arturo González Rascón called reporters to announce something shocking. The case had been solved in 2 days. He said teenager Laura Berenice Ramos Monares and 7 other girls were raped and strangled by 2 bus drivers who confessed. He said they confessed to dumping the 8 bodies at the parcel at Ejército Nacional and Paseo de la Victoria. Down the hallway, Miriam Garcia, the wife of one accused bus driver, and the lawyer Sergio Dante Almaraz claimed police wearing Halloween masks abducted the suspects from their homes and tortured them into confessing. They insisted the men had nothing to do with the crimes. Pause there. 2 days. 8 victims. Confessions. Masked torture allegations. In Juárez, speed is not always competence. Sometimes it is pressure. The file describes a buzz in state offices. Solve the case by Monday or heads would roll. In that climate, a confession becomes a tool, not a truth. And once the state decides it has an ending, it can order reality to obey. González Rascón read out the victims' names, insisting the suspects had provided full names, which made many skeptical. He declared victory, then ordered investigators back to their offices. The field was officially finished. Now we hold the victims at the center. Claudia Yvette González was 20. Esmeralda Herrera Monreal was 15. Laura Berenice Ramos Monares was 17. Mayor Juliana Reyes Solis was 17. Maria de Los Angeles Acosta Ramirez was 19. These were girls and young women with daily lives, not symbols. Claudia Yvette was a maquiladora worker, and her case holds one detail that slices clean through any attempt to blame the victim. She disappeared after her factory turned her away from work because she was 2 minutes late. 2 minutes. The file records that the company said it was standard procedure. Standard procedure, those words taste like cold metal when you realize the cost. 2 minutes late is the kind of detail that exposes how violence is not always a sudden explosion. Sometimes it begins as an administrative cruelty. A supervisor refuses entry. A gate closes. A young woman turns back toward the street. A bus schedule shifts. The day's rhythm is broken. And when your safety depends on routine, on getting onto a crowded bus, on walking with other workers, on arriving home before dark, then breaking routine can be deadly. The system that claims innocence here is the same one that later says, we couldn't have known, but you could have known. You did know. You just didn't care. Esmeralda's mother, Irma Monreal, worked at the Phillips plant. She blamed herself for moving her family from Zacatecas to Juárez to escape farm poverty. When her 15-year-old daughter failed to come home from her part-time job as a housekeeper, Irma asked police to dispatch a search patrol. They refused. Then, at work, a coworker told her that the television was reporting the discovery of several bodies. She rushed to the Attorney General's office in the morgue. A state police officer told her to pick up a newspaper if she wanted to know what was going on. That is not just rudeness. That is institutional cruelty. Benita Monares, Laura Berenice's mother, never got to see her daughter's body. She said officials told her she would not be able to handle it. Mothers wondered later whether the bodies they signed for were really their daughters, because the system had already betrayed them too many times. And still, the city tried to keep living. That is another cruelty. Grief has to share sidewalks with routine, because rent still comes, and shift schedules still start, and younger siblings still need dinner. Then the community responded with memory, and the system responded with intimidation. On the radio, Samira Itzagiri and her co-hosts voiced outrage. This was the third time in less than a decade that multiple bodies were found in a cluster. Lot Bravo, Lomas de Polio, and now the cotton field. Each time officials insisted there was no connection. Samira invited the community to a vigil at the cotton field and set a goal of 10,000 candles. On December 16, 2001, an estimated 25,000 people showed up. The field looked like a second city built from flame and refusal. When a community gathers like that, it is not only mourning, it is declaring that the official story is not enough. Candles become a public archive, names become a chorus, the wind becomes part of the ritual, and rituals make authorities nervous, because rituals can't be managed with press releases. Soon after, Samira's program was canceled, and she was blacklisted. A smear campaign followed. A receipt suggested government funds paid for an ad attacking her. Then the strange man at her child's school, holding a picture of Samira, the kind of threat that says, "We're not arguing with you, we're warning you." Shortly after that, several unidentified upper-class women funded a safety campaign aimed at young women called Be Alert. Many criticized it because it placed the burden of safety on women rather than on the authorities charged with protecting them. In Juárez, the state often asks girls to shrink instead of asking killers to stop. It tells them to travel in groups, avoid certain streets, dress differently, and watch their backs. At the same time, it refuses to clean its own house. The police, the prosecutors, the evidence rooms, the courts now return to the cotton field, because this is where the story tightens into a braid. The forensics chief, Oscar Menes Grijalva, had barely begun his scientific work when he learned higher-ups already had suspects in custody. Years earlier, he had warned officials in writing about the possibility of a serial killer, and superiors brushed him off. One cursed at him and told him to get his report out of there. In 2001, Menes watched heavy machinery arrive to dig large holes in the parcel. He stopped the work, warning that the equipment could destroy evidence. Then he says something that should make your blood run cold. State police asked his staff to help plant evidence against the two bus drivers. He and his team checked the van that the police claimed the suspects used. They applied luminol to detect even faint traces of blood. The van was clean. Menes also warned about something else. The state announced names before DNA tests could confirm identities. He concluded, "Something smells." Shortly after authorities reopened the parcel, journalists inspected the site. Yellow and red police tape flapped in the wind. Wooden stakes and white string formed rectangles labeled where each body had been found. The first 3 bodies were found on November 6th in a ditch parallel to the cotton field. 5 more were found the next day at the other end, inside another ditch under heaps of trash. 1 body was left near a tree with mistletoe by an irrigation ditch. Nearby, people found a mound of long, reddish-brown hair and a bone fragment. They photographed them and dropped them at the forensics office. How does evidence remain in a scene declared finished? That question matters. Now comes the underpass, our refrain. February 24th, 2002. 2 U.S. advocacy groups helped organize a new sweep of the cotton field parcel at the family's request. Mothers came. City police came to keep an eye on things. Band of civiles, volunteers came. Citizens with CB radios experienced in searching the desert edges for bodies. On the other side of the Ejército Nacional underpass, which is actually a concrete drain with enough room for several people to hide, the volunteers found women's clothing, shoes, underwear, and mounds of hair. The underpass is a piece of infrastructure, but in this story it becomes a symbol, a place where the city's movement passes above while the truth hides below. The underpass also simply exposes the city's cruelty. Roads are built for cars, for trade, for moving goods quickly. Pedestrians are an afterthought. Workers are cutting under concrete because the city is not designed to protect their safety. And when women disappear, that design becomes part of the evidence. A killer doesn't need to invent a trap. The city builds it. The underpass, the empty lots, the poorly lit stretches. These are institutional decisions that become physical vulnerability. And then the dramatic find, Claudia Yvette Gonzalez's missing overalls. Her mother, Josefina, gasped when a young boy showed her the beige overalls. He had found them inside a yellow plastic bag from a Soriana grocery store by the ditch in the cotton field. Josefina grabbed the clothing and held it as though she were embracing her daughter. That image is the moral center of the whole saga. A mother forced to hug cloth because the state will not give her the truth. The searchers had decided to let families pick out any items they recognized. City police called state police instead. State investigators rushed in and seized the items. The families never got their chance. The next day, state police ordered a formal sweep and reported finding Claudia Yvette's Lear Corporation employee badge. Maynes said there was no way his staff could have overlooked all those items in November. They had conducted a thorough search and photographed the sites. There had been nothing. That leaves a terrible possibility. Someone, the killers or their accomplices, returned to the site after the solved press conference and planted the overalls and badge. If that is true, the cotton field was not only a dump site, it was a stage. And staging requires access, confidence, and a system that does not ask hard questions. This is why the Killing Fields language is not an exaggeration when used as witness language. It is not about spectacle. It is about repetition, disposal, and a system that turns women into expendable labor in life and expendable problems in death. Josefina González said something that many people in Juárez felt in their bones. Someone rich and powerful has to be involved. Only someone like that can keep getting away with this. The Attorney General defended a professional investigation, but professionalism does not explain why evidence appears later in a grocery bag. Professionalism does not explain why a van is clean. Professionalism does not explain why a case is solved before science speaks. Now comes the part of the story that turns truth into contraband. In March of 2002, a collarbone fragment sat in the glove compartment of a car inside a clear package labeled evidence, driven across the Bridge of the Americas into El Paso. Border inspections were intense after September 11th, 2001, with waits stretching to 2 or 3 hours, and cars searched under the hood and in the trunk. Imagine the absurdity, a bone fragment more frightening than any weapon, because it carries the question, did the state lie? This fragment was precious because the rest of the body had been cremated. The test would cost $4,000. Justice for the women of Juárez paid for it as a favor to the family. Why did the bone have to cross the border? Because the Mexican Federal Laboratory's DNA testing could not confirm the identities of 7 of the 8 cotton field victims. That result threw mothers into an emotional tailspin. It meant the state had read names into microphones before it actually knew whose bodies those names belonged to. In Juárez, that kind of mistake is not an accident in a clean room. It's a symptom of a system that wanted closure faster than truth. And once you lose trust like that, you never fully get it back. Every envelope becomes suspicious. Every signature feels like a trap. Benita Moneres traveled to give another sample. A technician struggled to find a vein. My veins are very small, she said. She also provided hair with roots intact. The California laboratory confirmed a match. The bone fragment belonged to Laura Berenice Ramos. And in a detail that feels like a cruel joke, the result was disclosed through a television show with the mother present, as if a woman had to perform grief on camera to receive truth. Now comes the fact that makes this saga one of the most disturbing in Latin American history. Not because it is mysterious, but because it is institutionally rotten. The state misidentified victims. In August of 2006, Chihuahua state authorities announced that 3 of the 8 cotton field victims were not dead but missing. Guadalupe, Lupita, Luna de la Rosa, Barbara Aracely Martinez Ramos, and Veronica Martinez Hernandez. 5 years after officials blamed 2 bus drivers, the state admitted those women were still missing. 2 of the 8 bodies were correctly identified as Maria Rosina Galicia Meraz and Merlin Elizabeth Rodriguez Sands. Galicia, 17, who worked across the downtown cathedral, was reported missing in August 2001. Rodriguez, 16, was last seen in April 2000. And then there is the detail that turns the knife. Barbara Aracely Martinez Ramos's mother, Maria de Jesus Ramos Villanueva, died of illness in March of 2006. Her crusade ended before she could know with certainty whether her daughter was dead or alive. That is bureaucratic murder, not with a knife, not with a gun, but with denial, delay, and indifference. Argentine experts positively identified other cotton field victims as Claudia Yvette González, Mayra Juliana Reyes Solis, Esmeralda Herrera Monreal, and Maria de los Angeles Acosta Ramirez. The 8th victim's identity remained pending. The state had not only failed to stop killings, it had failed at the basic act of naming the dead. So when people ask, is this a cover-up or incompetence? The honest answer, based on the record, is that it can be both, and they can overlap. A system so eroded that it can't safeguard evidence, maintain a clean chain of custody, protect witnesses, or even match names to bodies will look like a cover-up even when some parts are merely incompetent. But the cotton field also carries allegations and contradictions that push beyond simple incompetence. Evidence that appears later, a forensics chief asked to plant proof, a clean van, and a case declared solved before DNA returns. In such a climate, cover-up stops sounding like a rumor and becomes a reasonable suspicion. Now we address intimidation, because this saga is not only about murdered women, it is also about murdered truth. 3 months after the discovery of the 8 bodies, the defense lawyers were tearing apart the official case, pointing out the lack of physical evidence, the contradictions, and the torture allegations. They received death threats. And then, on February 5th, 2002, lawyer Mario Escobedo Anaya was killed. Authorities first claimed police mistook him for a fugitive. Later, they claimed he fired and the police acted in self-defense. But the file insists the crash did not kill him, a gunshot did. Photographs later suggested bullet holes were planted in a police vehicle to support self-defense claims. Whether every detail is prosecutable or not, the message landed. Challenging the state narrative could cost you your life. A year later, in February of 2003, one of the accused bus drivers, Gustavo González Meza, died in prison under suspicious circumstances after a surgery. The other accused, Victor Javier Garcia Uribe, was eventually released for lack of evidence. Federal authorities applied the Istanbul Protocol and determined Garcia had been tortured, yet the case returned without sanctions. 2 state police officers visited Garcia and asked him to drop the torture charges. He refused. 2 years later, on January 25, 2006, his lawyer, Sergio Dante Almaraz Mora, was murdered in downtown Juárez in the afternoon, shot at an intersection with security cameras inexplicably malfunctioning or frozen. This is intimidation as infrastructure. It teaches the city to whisper. When Samira Itzagire lit the field with 25,000 candles, the system punished her. When lawyers challenged confessions and torture, the system killed them. When families were asked to inspect evidence, the system seized it. When science contradicted official certainty, the system delayed correction for years. This is why people in Juárez did not need a conspiracy to feel that something unusual was happening. The system behaved like a living thing protecting itself. The file even notes that international experts later observed patterns of corruption, systematic errors, lack of scientific corroboration, and the probability that organized crime interfered with investigations and judicial processes. Now pull back, but keep the cotton field in frame, because the cotton field is not only about 8 victims, it is about how the broader crisis of femicide was allowed to become normal. A city built on young women's labor treated those women as disposable. An elite class, the record suggests, did not mobilize to protect poor women. They don't care about poor women, one activist said, explaining why the business class did not rise in defense of the workers who made them wealthy. Instead, elites funded image management and safety campaigns that shifted the burden onto women. If you want to hear harvest as witness language, listen there. The economy harvested women's labor, then failed to protect women's lives. The downtown landscape matters because so many last sightings happened there. 15 minutes on foot from the Paso del Norte Bridge, a short walk to one of the safest cities in the United States. Juárez Avenue, the Kentucky Club, the Noa Noa, the nightclubs, the red light district, taxi drivers who know what can be bought, tourists who come for cheap liquor and souvenirs. Teenagers cross from the U.S. side for nightlife because of Mexico's lower drinking age. In the same zone, girls vanished in daylight. That contrast is not just dramatic, it is political. It shows how violence can live next door to prosperity and still be treated like a local inconvenience. The record also describes other clusters and the way authorities disputed even the basic act of counting. Bodies found in one place, then denied, then admitted later. Victims tied to ordinary institutions, schools, beauty academies, shops near the cathedral, living inside predictable routes. Those details matter because they show a city with repeated hunting grounds, places girls go because they have to, not because they are careless. When you map the city by last sightings, you don't see a hidden forest. You see bus routes, you see shift schedules, you see the machinery of ordinary life turned into a trap. Now, about the competing interpretations. The record supports the possibility of serial perpetrators, one or more than one, because patterns recur in victim profiles, locations, and methods. The record also supports opportunistic violence, because in a city flooded with impunity, multiple offenders can exploit the same vulnerabilities. It supports the possibility of protected actors, not as a fantasy, but as a logic derived from intimidation, corruption, and systemic obstruction. It supports the idea that incompetence and cover-up can overlap, because the same institutional failure that loses evidence can also be weaponized to protect someone. What we cannot responsibly do is point to a single cinematic mastermind and declare the case solved. The entire tragedy here is that the system repeatedly pretended it was solved. There is one more truth that must be said out loud, because it's part of the Latin memory stance. Misogyny is not just a personal attitude. In these files, it becomes a policy tool. Officials smeared victims as living double lives. They called them loose. They hinted they were prostitutes. They blamed families. They minimized patterns. And each time a mother was treated as a nuisance, told to buy a newspaper, or told she could not see her child, misogyny was being practiced as procedure. Procedure is how injustice becomes routine. Routine is how a harvest continues, not by magic, but by bureaucracy. So if you're asking whether this is one of the most intriguing and disturbing unsolved crime sagas in Latin American history, the answer is yes. And the reason is not entertainment. The reason is moral and historical. The cotton field sits in public view, and still the system produced a 2-day solution that collapsed under DNA. Evidence later appeared in a Soriana bag under an underpass large enough to hide several people. A forensics chief alleged evidence planting and found the alleged abduction van clean. Names were read into microphones before science returned. 5 years later, 3 women were declared still missing, and a mother died without certainty. Journalists were punished. Lawyers were killed. That is not a normal cold case. That is a society negotiating with its own shame. We end where we began, the cotton field at the busy corner. It is not only a location, it is a mirror. It reflects a city forced to keep functioning beside horror, and a system that tried to close the story before it was properly opened. Campo Algodonero forces the central question into daylight. How could bodies be dumped so publicly and the response still be so broken? The record suggests an answer that Latin America knows too well. Power invested in silence. Silence for commerce, silence for pacts, silence for stability. In that silence, women became expendable. If you've listened this far, I won't ask you to guess names or feed speculation. That is not witness work. I'll ask something safer and harder. Where have you seen the paperwork go quiet in your own life? At a police station, a workplace, a hospital, a court, a school. A complaint mocked, a report was ignored, a woman blamed for what was done to her. A file is transferred until it disappears. Share what you can without exposing anyone. Memory is sacred, and safety is sacred too. In Juárez, the killers not only stole lives, they tried to steal meaning. Meaning is what we can still defend. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.